Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on redefining leadership, moving business performance from KPIs to a mind-blowing creative approach worthy of a standing ovation. I am Leah Carter, Head of Events at AMBA and BJ, and I'll be your host today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the day, Dr. Mark Powell and Jonathan Gifford. Dr. Mark Powell and Jonathan Gifford are authors of the 5 Principles of Performance Thinking. Dr. Mark Powell is a business writer, consultant, and entrepreneur with over 30 years' experience. His increasing focus has been using performing arts to solve modern-day business challenges. Jonathan Gifford is a business author who formerly worked in advertising and magazine publishing. He studied philosophy at University in Kent and played saxophone semi-professionally. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to today's illustrious speakers. Jonathan and Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here today, and I hope that we can enlighten you about some different ways of thinking about the world from a performance perspective, and that's kind of our mission today. So I'm going to take you through not just what performance thinking is, but I think a bit of the background behind it, because I think that's very important to kind of look at. By way of intro, why is my now for some reason I can't. Well, the slides are up, but I can't. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I had used it wrong. Apologies for that. Right. So, just by way of a brief intro, as Leah said, Jonathan and I have been kind of business partners and partners in crime for quite a long time. Jonathan's background is particularly in sort of business writing and publishing, and has written some fantastic books around great leadership ideas. And we kind of connected a few years ago when I was doing some work at the Oxford Business School around how do you get leaders to think differently about the challenges they face. What's interesting also with Jonathan, he's a bit older now, but also he had a parallel career as a professional saxophonist, and this is quite relevant to where we're going to go today. I had a slightly different path. I've basically been a strategy consultant for 30 odd years. I've also been an academic at various times, and have taught and developed programs for leaders at a number of business schools around the world. So Jonathan and I had an interesting connection, however, and that was the arts. This is me a few years ago. I was slightly younger, to be totally fair. I also had a 25-year professional dance career, which I ran in parallel to my business career. And what I was increasingly finding was that what I was having to do to be successful as a dancer was actually increasingly making me more successful within my business career rather than the other way around. I also spent a long time in the sort of executive ed world, mainly trying to teach very senior executives how to think differently about business and performance. And I learned a few things. The first thing I learned is the hardest thing to do is to get anybody who's senior executive to actually stop doing things. We are processed to be active, to be busy, to complete things on a to-do list. And that's increasingly a real problem in terms of driving business performance. And again, we'll come back to that as we go through. The second thing you find out is that the organization is very poor at speaking to its employees. And what you tend to find is there's two very different conversations in organizations. One is around the organization telling its people, do things differently and be better and perform better. And the other conversation, which never really has, is the individuals going back to the organization saying, if you want us to act differently, you have to help us act differently. Again, this is quite relevant to performance thinking, and we'll come back to this as well. The other thing you also tend to find is that it is very, very difficult for executives in a business context to think artistically. And this is a core problem because it stifles innovation and creativity. And again, we'll come back to that. The last thing that we find in terms of my experience in exec ed is we don't very seldom talk about the audience we play to as an organization or as individuals within organizations. We focus on what we're doing ourselves. We never focus enough on thinking through and understanding the experience of ourselves or the experience of our organizations from where the audience sits. And again, that's we'll come back as we go through. So Jonathan and I, our entire focus is really this idea that actually we have to think differently around how individuals and organizations generate performance. It's what we call the steam engine effect. And what's interesting is we know over the last 20, 30 years in particular, particularly as the world has evolved, particularly with the evolution of the internet and a whole bunch of geopolitical evolutions, that organizations are struggling to drive performance in the way they traditionally have. And yet we hang on to traditional ways of doing business because it's easy to hang on to traditional ways of doing business. The steam engines are not terribly useful, but we know they work, so let's just stay with what we know. The other part is we've got to start thinking much more artistically and understand what that means in the context of an organization. Again, it's something that organizations really struggle with. So Jonathan and I have spent the last several years really trying to understand what is it that drives performance in an artistic way, and how can we use that to help individuals and organizations change the whole way they approach business performance. Ultimately, that comes down to a massive shift in culture. An organizational culture hasn't really changed for 50 years. Whatever organizations say, most organizations have the same cultural aspirations. They want to be inclusive and they want to be friendly and nice to fluffy animals. But fundamentally, that's not culture as I think we understand it. So we'll get a little bit around this whole concept of creating performance cultures. The last thing I think is that a lot of our time is spent connecting individuals and businesses to performing artists themselves. And what we find is that connection is incredibly powerful in getting organizations to rethink how they run their own businesses. And this is a picture from a workshop we ran recently for the board of a large power company, and on the left are the reigning British professional Latin champions. And by spending time with them, they completely changed the whole way they thought about how they were working together as a team to drive performance in their own organization. From another perspective, and over lots of research, so these are three of the books we've written recently, it all connects to this ultimate theme of we've got to think differently about performance if we're going to change the way our organizations work. And that also means that individuals have to rethink how they think about their own performances if they are going to be successful in the world going forward. So ultimately, today is really about the book that Leah mentioned, The 5 Principles of Performance Thinking, which is kind of the end of our journey over the last 10 years, pretty much, of trying to kind of understand and codify how we can translate performance artists' work into a business and individual context. So let's explore what that means. And I'm proud to say we did actually get onto the business chart for W.H. Smith. Thought I'd do a bit of self-promotion there, but apologies for that. Let's start with kind of where this all starts. The first thing that's interesting to think about is that we are fundamentally trained to look at things in the same way. And that's the same with university, with MBA programs. We are trained to look at things increasingly in very rational, logical, structured ways, because historically that was how we performed best. We worked out what we needed to do, we did it efficiently, we applied scientific management principles and made it more efficient. In the industrial era, we applied time and motion studies. And over time, we have found it very, very hard to think of things in a different way than the way we have been trained to do from the age of 5. So the question is we often pose to organizations is, what are the biggest challenges that you are facing? And the answer we usually get is this one. The biggest challenge facing organizations is they're not going to generate different results if they don't think differently about how they're doing it. Most organizations are very good at being technically proficient. They're very good at organizing themselves. They're very good at running processes. They're very good at hiring people, developing people. They're very good at putting systems in. What they're not good at is adapting completely different ways of thinking about performance. And that's what we're going to try to explore. Now, the question is, why do we do that? As I say, we talked about the steam engine effect, which is every time we talk to organizations, they tell us we know we need to do things in a different way. We need to think differently. And as the conversation goes, you find out that fundamentally they have no intention of doing it. And the answer is always we get is, well, the way we do it, we know it's not really working, but it sort of works, and changing it sounds very, very painful. And we hang on to the same ways of doing things on an ongoing basis. But the other issue is that ultimately this is not working. If you look at why, we think there are 2 fundamental reasons. One is humanization, which is kind of a term we use. And this kind of connects to the whole millennial concept, which is actually over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen an increasing evolution that individuals want meaning in the work that they do. And they also want that to enable them to work in different ways. And we're seeing this increasingly with the, and there's been hundreds of books written about the conflict between the millennials and the new generations and how they are unconnecting to the way traditional organizations have worked. The other thing we think is sort of interesting is the concept of value shift, which I'll come back to shortly, which is actually the value systems of people have changed so radically that they are increasingly disconnected to how organizations approach everything that they do. The search for meaning, I mean, Apple is the most often used example, and there's that famous Simon Sinek video, which I'm sure you've all seen on YouTube, which basically says that ultimately the key is everybody doesn't care about what you do, they want to know why you do what you do. And increasingly that's been used from a marketing point of view, but what we're finding is organizations and individuals need to find this same answer to the same question. I interview lots and lots of people for jobs, And I'm absolutely amazed how few tell me why I should give them a job. They tell me what they do, they tell me what their education is, they tell me what they've achieved, but they never give them the answer to, but why should I hire you? Because they come in a technical mindset. Let's look at this interestingly to put this into kind of a perspective. If you were to ask the question, when I grew up, I want to help people, right? So the top 5 dream jobs in 1966. This is a questionnaire that's been run in Sunday Times for very, very, very many years. They run every few years. In 1966, the top 5 dream jobs that people between under the age of 25 aspired to was teacher, scientist, footballer. Well, World Cup not a great surprise on that one. Explorer or adventurer. Doctor. Doctor was number one. Number one aspiration in 1966 for kids coming through from 16 to 25 is to be a doctor. Interestingly, if you'll notice, most of those are quite technical fields. In 2016, now what do we want to do? Writer. YouTube sensation. Artist. Photographer. Designer. That is a heck of a shift in the space of basically from my generation to the next generation. So the whole attitudes and mindsets and aspirations of individuals is changing so radically, and organizations are struggling to get their heads around what that is going to mean in practical terms. And we've seen increasing evidence that traditional approaches to performance are not working. And one of the challenges is most organizations, when they talk about performance, KPIs, all they're actually looking at is historically how much money they made or lost. They don't really tell them how to change the process to improve what they made or lost. These were my profits. Yeah, from last year. How are you going to make more profits next year? I have no idea. Woolworths, House of Fraser, Reader's Digest, Blockbuster, Toys R Us, Staples, many others have all gone bust. And don't for 1 minute just say, oh, that's the internet. Yes, that has had an effect, particularly on retailers. But the reality is there are many, many retailers today that are absolutely thriving, growing, and making increasing profits. So it's not just about the high street being destroyed by the internet. It's a lazy view of what's happening in retail. It's beyond that. We'll look at a particular example in a while. So increasingly what we said is actually we've got to think differently. We need a different set of language. We need a different set of ideas if we're going to change organizations. And if individuals themselves are going to be more successful, they're also going to have to adopt new approaches as well. And we believe the answer is into looking at performing arts and how performers work together to deliver really winning performances. So let's look at what that means. First of all, we go back to the culture question I talked about before. Our view is that culture is actually not what everyone says culture is. Most culture statements when organizations talk about culture is an aspiration of, as I said, being inclusive and loving fluffy animals. Our view is culture is actually very, very different. It's around the extent in which organizations can drive creativity and the extent to which organizations can get connectivity between themselves and their staff. And we've built and run all sorts of diagnostic tools that will show that large numbers of organizations have massive disconnection between their individuals, and the culture they state is their culture is actually a statement of a desire. It is not a culture that is experienced by the vast majority of the people who work there. So what is performance thinking? Well, let's have a look. Performance thinking is not a complex concept. It's actually quite simple. There are 5 principles, and we'll talk a little bit about all of them. Developing a performance mindset, building connected ensembles, telling stories, rehearsing, and delighting audiences. It seems like a pretty simple list, but that actually is kind of the point. We spent years and thousands of hours interviewing, working with, and watching how performing artists work. And ultimately, trying to bring that down to 5 concepts that you can understand and connect to is actually not as easy as it sounds. It took us a long time to do it. But what's interesting about this particular list is if I put that list to an artist, whether it's a dancer or a musician or an actor, it connects to all of them in terms of the things that they focus on to be truly successful. Developing a performance mindset. What do we mean by that? Well, let's have a look at this. First of all, the first point around performance mindset is not that technical mastery does not matter. Okay, the first thing is technical mastery is an absolute requirement. So it's not the saying just be a great performer, but you have to be technically good. You know, this is Lang Lang. Some of you may be familiar with him. Some people reckon he's possibly the greatest pianist ever. This is his life at the age of 5. Right? So make no mistake, Lang Lang is an artist, but he practiced and practiced to become a master of what he does. So ultimately, the starting point with the performance mindset is you still have to accept that technical mastery matters. You know, if you're in business, if you're a strategy consultant, as I was for many, many years, you have to be good at being a strategy consultant. The challenge is that doesn't mean you're going to be successful just because you actually are a master of your craft, but you have to be a master of craft. The difference is, in the arts, it's a given that you're a master of your craft, or you wouldn't be there at all. The second part of the mindset, and this is, I think, one that really organizations and individuals do struggle with a lot, is this idea that creativity and performance is not a linear process. That to be great, to put on a great performance, you often have to go round the houses a lot. Organizations are very uncomfortable with this idea that effectively I can't just kind of take a straight line. They like to know that I've got activity, I've got my time, I've got my budget, and I'm on a trajectory from left to right. And if the line is not straight, the assumption is that's probably costing me money or costing me time, and that is not a good thing. From a performance mindset point of view, that is irrelevant. All that matters is whether you get to the end point and put on a better performance than anybody else. And if it takes you long to get there, it doesn't matter. Because if you get there in a shorter time but with worse performance, you lose anyway. So this idea that time and money and the typical ways organizations approach performance and how they're doing and how they manage their KPIs, in a performance area, you don't even think about it. All you focus on is what are the things I need to try to do, some of which may fail, that will get me to where I'm trying to go. The other interesting thing, and this is been my bugbear most of my career, is my experience within organizations and most individuals in organizations is there is a huge focus on activity. People have to be seen to be doing things, producing reports, ticking lists of things to do, phoning lots of people on their list of things they said they would do and phone. But do not confuse activity with forward motion. And a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals in organizations get very confused. And they think that activity is actually moving them forward. Often, it's the activity that is moving you backwards, and the lack of thinking and focus on thinking that actually moves you forward rather than backwards. The other thing that's sort of interesting for us is that a lot of people assume that just because they're good at something, they will create a masterpiece. I'll give you an example from a slightly more practical kind of consulting area where historically I've worked a lot. So I work with hundreds of consulting teams. And my experience has been that when you're in pitches, 9 times out of 10, the best technical proposal does not win. So the best artist from a technical point of view never gets to win the competition. Because what tends to happen is they focus so much on their technical capability, they do not focus enough on the concept of how they engage with the people who are going to pick them. So just because you can paint doesn't mean you are going to create a masterpiece. So the mindset issue is around getting your head into thinking about different assumptions and rules of thumb for how to be successful in an organization or as an individual. The second principle, building connected ensembles. And in one sense, this is one of the hardest ones of all to do, and in our view, probably one of the most important ones. Being connected is a key part of this. We work with a very famous lady called Patsy Rodenberg, and she wrote a famous book called The Second Circle. She basically is a voice and acting coach who works for the Royal Shakespeare Company and with RADA. And a big part of her focus within the acting environment is that the success of an actor is fundamentally linked to how they are able to connect with an audience. And that is not a technical thing. It is how you approach that point. It's a very interesting book, even from a business point of view. It's a book I'd highly recommend you read if you ever get the chance, because it is just as applicable to the business context as it is to an artistic context. And this idea, and I know this from my own dancing career, is often in business context, we look at people, but we don't really see them. We don't connect to them. And it's very important within an artistic context that you get that connection, because it's very uncomfortable as an audience, if you're dealing with performers, if they don't connect with you in a way that connects to what's inside, not just to your eyeballs, then effectively the performance will ultimately fail. And we need to take that same way of approaching how we connect, whether it's in an interview, whether it's in a client pitch, whether it's how an organization or we connect to customers. The concept of how you actually make sure you truly connect with someone is a non-trivial issue and very, very important. We think you can learn a lot from the theatre. Now, if you look at how theatres work, ensembles, this is actually a group that we worked with before, and the gentleman on the right-hand side is a gentleman called Piers Ibbotson, who's worked with us a lot. Piers was formerly with the Royal Shakespeare Company as a director. And one of the things that we've worked on with Piers is this idea of how do ensembles work? Now, organizations are very uncomfortable with the idea of an ensemble, because an ensemble ultimately is a cast of equals. Within the ensemble, we might all have different roles, and there is ultimately someone, you might be on a play, and so Derek Jacobi, a great thespian actor, he is the main character, he's being paid most of the money, and he's a knight of the realm. And down here, I've got a guy called Bob, who's just out of drama school, his first ever play, and he's absolutely terrified. Now, if you have a hierarchical position, the chances are Bob is never going to engage with anything because he will be too terrified to even put his hand up. So the theatre spend a lot of time trying to get status and hierarchy out of the equation, because hierarchy within an ensemble, within a theatre, will kill anything you want to try to do. Because one of the things you've got to try to do as an ensemble is you've got to try to develop new ways of doing things, new approaches, many of which will fail. And in that environment, everyone's view might be equally valid. So to give you an example, you might be putting on Hamlet. Hamlet has been put on 10 billion times around the world, and you're going to do it again. And the first thing is, how do we find something different to do with Hamlet? And the reality is that Sir Derek Jacobi, who's played Hamlet 30 times himself, is probably run out of ideas, and you need everybody in that room to be prepared to put themselves forward and to come up with new ideas, new ways of approaching how they're going to put the play on. And what theatre directors will do is, before they go anywhere near learning the lines for the play, is they will spend time with that group of people, turning them into a group of people that are so comfortable with themselves that they are able to innovate as a collective team. Now, to give you an example about some of the games they do, but basically they will spend days, sometimes weeks, going nowhere near the play, but just working together as a group until they can create the dynamic whereby status and hierarchy are not relevant to their process of trying to create a great performance. This is a kids game. My son does it at school, and actually, but we've done this with lots and lots of dudes. And the idea here is basically you sit in a circle, you close your eyes, and your goal is to count as high as you can. One person goes 1, 2, 3, but obviously you can't see each other, and you can't see what they're doing. And what's interesting, if you ask a group of people to do this quickly, you'd be surprised most people can't get to 10 without two people saying the same letter, same number, then they have to start again. But part of that is about, because people are very bad at allowing space within a team to enable people to have their voice heard. That is what the power of ensembles comes from within the artistic concept. So ultimately, within the concept of ensembles, until everyone in the room is equal before the task, you cannot create anything new. And that's a key part of performing, is you have to always be able to create something new if you are going to continue to be most successful. Whether it's a play or whether as a dancer when I'm trying to win a competition, ultimately, if I don't work with my dance partner in that kind of same way, it's not just a group that can apply to couples, or if you look at the way a jazz group works with a group of 4 or 5 or 6, it's the same principle. If you have status and hierarchy within organizations, it is very hard to create anything new. We played an interesting game, it's called the card game, and I take a group of people and I give them a bunch of cards, right? And you ask them to basically not show anybody else the card they've got, but they walk around the room, say hello to each other, but act in the status represented on your card. So if you're a queen, you're very high status. If you're an ace, you're very low status. And what's really interesting is then at the end of a few minutes, you ask them to line themselves up in order so that they basically think where they are in the hierarchy structure. And what's interesting, if you're very high status, Jack, Queen, King, you know exactly where you are and you're usually in the right order. If you're ace 2, 3, similar. If you're very low status, you know exactly where you are. The problem is in the middle. If you're a 4, 5, or a 6, you have no idea where you sit in that equation. So again, the point is actually you've got to get people to take status out if you're going to truly create new things and be highly successful in terms of delivering great performances. And again, you'll see it if you look at a jazz group, the way it works, to go from Jonathan's background, and we spent a lot of time working with jazz groups. And what is amazing about jazz groups is that ultimately they are some of the best technical musicians in their business. But if they start being prima donnas or start basically trying to take control or take a lead, the whole thing fails completely. And they know intrinsically that they have to allow each person to have their moment to be brilliant if the whole group is going to put on the greatest performance. That is not, in my experience, what happens in most organizations, far from it, in fact. So ultimately, if you take that back to what does that mean for leadership, what it means is leadership has to rethink what leadership is. Because actually, great leaders do not chart direction. Great leaders do not take control. In the performance world, great leaders create the environment within which performances can evolve. They create an environment within which you can take status and hierarchy out of the equation. They allow people, no matter what status they might have historically been, to feel capable and able to put their view in, to create new ideas, to drive great performances. The third one is about telling stories. Now, we know for a long time that the Indians have had, for example, had a great history of storytelling as a way not just of keeping history alive, but around engaging people within history. So storytelling is a very long kind of concept, and there's increasing focus around how to take storytelling into organizations. Now, if you look at it from a human point of view, and there is lots of research on this, go onto Google, you'll find lots. But as human beings, we are programmed to emotionally respond to a story, right? And actually, if you look at it, let's give you an example. EasyJet.com, right? EasyJet.com a few years ago ran into big troubles. They had huge problems with staff engagement, huge turnover of staff. Customers weren't very happy. Now, at its core, what is EasyJet? It's a budget airline. It's cheap and cheerful, and usually drops you off 300 miles from where you actually want to be. And I was involved in a program a number of years ago to try to work out how they should tell stories to engage both their customers and their employees. And what was interesting was when you actually looked at what their story wasn't, we're here to give you cheap flights to somewhere you don't want to be. This was actually their story. This is what EasyJet actually did. And we did this process called manifestos, where you really try to actually tell the story to engage people. And if you read this quickly on the screen, you can see that is actually what EasyJet does do. Interestingly, as soon as they engaged around this manifesto, their actually results started to change because people who worked with them realized that actually there was a human connection to what this business was about. I'm part of enabling these amazing things for people to happen, enabling people to realize their dreams, enabling people to fall in love. That's what we do. Now, the power of that story churned their results around. Okay, they did a few other things besides, to be fair. This is a very famous one. You can probably tell from the writing. This is Adidas. What do Adidas do? They make sports clothes, much of which is basically made in sweatshops in China. This is what they do. This is their story. This is what connects people to them. Whether it's their staff, whether it's people buying their brand, it's about what they do. That's their story. And we have got to get better at not just being able to tell stories from an advertising point of view, but from any organization. And also, what's your own personal story? What is your version of this that you want to sell if you're going for a job, or if you're pitching for work for a client, or even within your own friend circle? What is my story? Why is it you want to be a friend with me? Because this is why you want to be. This is not what I am, it's why I am. So ultimately, set yourself the manifesto challenge. Ask yourself, what is your personal story? If you were to tell your story, your manifesto, what is it? But whatever you do, don't use the words what, think about the why. Why should I want to hire you? Why should I want to give you that project or that job? Why do I want to be your friend? And we are very bad at thinking in why terms and expressing it clearly. The fourth one is probably my personal favorite, and it's the concept of rehearsal and rehearsing creativity. I did a survey a couple of years ago of about 150 different companies, and we were trying to get down to, if you could focus on the absolute number one business issue, what is it? Now, when we started the process, because it was an interview process, it was all about, we need to make more money, our P&L's off, our profits are off, our sales are off. But when you really cut into the driving forces, the number one business issue was a lack of creativity. Because everything else, when they looked at it, and we looked at it with them, was the result of a lack of thinking differently and changing the things they were doing. In other words, they were doing the same things the way they've always done them and expecting a different result. That old nugget around the definition of insanity. But fundamentally, that's what they were doing. And they were struggling to embrace creativity because it goes against all the things we talked about before. It's very hard to be creative if you have organizations geared around linear processes, which most are. It's very hard to be creative if individuals are KPI'd against everybody else and often forced to compete against their fellow colleagues. So the number one business issue increasingly is about the lack of creativity. Now, let me give you a study to bring this a little bit to life, because I think it's quite fun. Right, there's been a number of studies around creativity around the world. This is one that's come out, I think it was Stanford originally in the US. And they developed a creativity study that enabled you to test innate creativity in individuals, irregardless of what their age was. So, and they put it into different groups. And this was done for about 9,000 people, I think it was originally. So 5 to 7 years old, their innate creativity level, 97%. By the time they're 8 to 13, that has gone down to 71%. So that's where my son is. My son is 9, and I can see this happening to him because as he's gone from kind of kindergarten, pre-prep school, all of a sudden he's got spelling tests and reading tests, and he's being tested. and he's getting focused, and his mum wants him to be focused and get results and all the rest of it. And you can already see that his way of thinking is becoming reduced in terms of how creatively he approaches the world. 14 to 25, you're down to 43%. Harry Potter. There we go. So you're almost half what you were within literally, 7-8 years. 25 to 35. This is your core going into the workplace environment. You're now building your careers, extend your careers, consolidating your careers, and you're down to 27%. Once you get over 35, it's really bad news, and this is where also most people are in their later careers. You're down to 11% creativity levels, because ultimately that's what organizations and modern education do to us. There's a famous Ken Robinson video on YouTube. Again, many of you have seen it, probably seen it. It's one of the most famous YouTube videos of all, and he talks about the whole issue around the lack of creativity and how education is fundamentally destroying it in our individuals. And part of the challenge for us as individuals is how do we embrace and keep creativity alive as a human concept, not just what do you mean by creativity generally, but as it is to me. I'll give you another example. World's favorite toy. Lego is the #1 toy brand in the world. It has been for quite some time. I personally love Lego, and my son absolutely loves Lego. This is a set I got for him a while ago, a Coast Guard set. Really fun to build it, and this is what I like to do. I mean, the joy of following instructions is just fantastic, because you see this thing building, that's fantastic. This is what my son did. The ultimate interstellar star destroyer. He doesn't want to follow instructions, because all you're doing is building something that 10,000 other people have built before. He built something completely unique, because he doesn't want to create the same stuff. That's not what drives him. And he did this when he was about 7. I'm not sure he would actually be able to do this now, because again, I'm seeing the effects of education starting to kill that creativity in him. Because ultimately, we are programmed to create the same things again and again and try to create them slightly better. We are not programmed to create new things. And organizations do not, generally speaking, enable us to create new things. All organizations I've ever worked for said, we want to do new stuff and creative stuff. But can you kind of do it without taking any risks at all? That'd be really great. And would you mind doing it without risking any money? And would you make sure you can do it in a way that if it doesn't work, we haven't lost anything? And the answer is, good luck with that one. We take Lego as an experience when we work with teams, for example. And if you take a little Lego set like a plane, and it's quite interesting. And what we do is we basically we have 2 groups, and we give that, on one side we give them the Lego set, and we basically split them into sub-teams, and we ask them to build the plane as fast as they can. And they get very excited. They all try different ways of doing it, or time in motion, or one person will build, other people feed bricks, or sub-assemblies. They come up with lots of different strategies, and they get very excited when they win, because we are programmed to win. And the team that gets the prize are very excited. They get one of our books, so that's not that exciting. And then we say, okay, take a break, have a coffee, and we bring them back, and we give them the same set of bricks, and we say, you have to build something new, and it can't be a plane, and you can't use instructions. And what's interesting is, first of all, the amount of argument that happens is just astounding, because they don't know how to approach a creative process without a structure. So they usually argue about how to do it. Very few teams I've worked with ever actually build anything in the time you give them, because they are so uncomfortable with the process around doing something new, because there are no instructions for it. And it brings home to them how they have to think differently if they want to be truly creative. Because ultimately, the next thing this goes into is the concept of practice versus rehearsal. We are very, what's the word, I suppose, I'm not really sure we actually understand the difference, but within artistic concept, practice and rehearsal are extremely different, right? Because practice is where you do something you know how to do, and you do it over and over and over again until it's perfect. In a dance context, which is obviously my background, you would take the same bit of choreography and you do it over and over and over and over again until it's technically as perfect as you can. Rehearsal is different. Rehearsal is where you try different things to see if they work, to see if they improve what you're doing. But the reality is that in 90% of the cases, what you try does not work. It fails. So as a dancer, I would spend hundreds of hours trying different types of choreography or different ways of doing choreography to make it look better so I would win more competitions. But 9 times out of 10, what I was trying didn't work. But every so often, I'd try something that improved my performance and enabled me to win a competition I may not otherwise have won. Organizations and individuals within business context, generally speaking, they don't rehearse. And in fact, most of them don't even practice. I can think of the number of times I've actually gone to big pitches for projects, and very often you don't even practice the pitch. You go in there and try to do it on the fly, and it doesn't generally work terribly well. And I have the same conversation with people I coach around going into interviews, which is rehearse your answers to the questions you are likely to get, And I'm amazed how few people actually rehearse and try different answers to the questions, let alone practice to make sure they give an answer in a very compelling way. The final part of this process is a slightly more ethereal one. It's called delighting your audience. So what does that sort of mean in practice? Well, let's have a think. From an arts context, they understand it, because when dancers dance in a competition, part of what enables the ones who win to win is, look, they don't just dance in front of the judges, but they actually try to bring it to life for the audience in different ways, in terms of how they connect to each other, the amount of effort they put in it, the approach to the costumes, everything is thought through. They don't just go out there and say, I'm going to do my dance. They think through every single aspect of their performance, from how they look, how they dress, how they move, where they position on the floor, what movement changes they might make for a particular floor. They think of every single aspect. So the last thing they don't really think about is the dancing, because they've already got that down. They are technically masters of what they do. But those who win, which are often not technically the absolute best dancers, they think about how to basically make people connect to them more than other couples. They think about bringing to life their ultimate performance. Now, this works in a business context. Many of you will probably recognize this as Apple's flagship store in Regent Street in London. They sell computers and watches, but what they do is they understand that they have to put on a performance for their customers, and that's what they do. Very few others actually do it quite the way they do it, and they had a pretty nice store before, but then they completely redeveloped it. It's their absolute global flagship, and it still amazes me. They sell very expensive, very good, but very expensive computers. But Apple is all about a performance, ultimately, in terms of how they engage with their customers. And people at certain times will queue out the door just to go in and talk to people about their products. If you look at people selling PCs, that you do not see very often. This is a case study we're actually working on at the moment. Most of you will probably be familiar with Toys R Us. And again, there's been saying, oh, it was the internet that killed Toys R Us. Yes and no. Of course, up to a point, that's true. But I think the CNBC quote is exactly right. Basically, they lost sight of what they were doing, and they just became a warehouse full of products. And therefore, the internet will kill them. Because if you're just having a warehouse full of products that I can see online, you're going to get killed. But interestingly, there are other toy companies, retail toy companies, that are doing very, very successfully. There's a company in the UK, Build-A-Bear Workshop, and basically they sell teddy bears. That's all they do. They sell teddy bears. One product only. But they've turned the whole process of buying a teddy into a complete performance. You go in, you pick your bear, you stuff your bear, you put a heart in the bear, you stuff it yourself, you go and give it a name, you get a birth certificate, you buy accessories. It takes an hour and costs an awful lot of money. My son has several of them. But kids love it, and they put on performance. They are also one of the most profitable toy companies in the country in terms of the margin they make, because they put on a performance. My son begs me to take him there to buy him another ridiculously expensive bear. So again, and it's a high street chain. There are other chains like The Entertainer and others in the UK. They just sell toys like Toys R Us did, but they do put on a performance. They engage with their customers and they make money. So when you bring all this together, what I say to you is this: organizations and individuals, the way we've been thinking about performance is working less and less well than it used to be. And the world's changed, and we're going to have to start changing more and more. And there are growing evidence that those who are able to apply some of the principles from performing arts are going to be more successful. And our view is that actually that's going to be increasingly focused on by businesses. And we talk to lots of companies who are asking a question: where else can I go? I need to think differently. And a few years ago, they tried looking at sports. Sports can help us. Let's look at how sports people work. But the reality is, sports people is largely around time and motion. It's around small improvements in technical things to make you go faster, longer, whatever. And actually, most organizations have abandoned the idea that sports can really help them that much. But there is a growing interest in looking at arts as a new tool, as a new model, to rethinking how we might change aspects of our organization, particularly around engaging ensemble behavior and creativity in terms of rehearsing and trying new things to generate different results. So when it comes to, I think there are a bunch of questions that this comes down to that ask you to think about, both within your own organizations or with your own context, in terms of whether you're a new MBA looking for a job, or whether you're in an existing job and looking at what your organization's doing. And the questions we would pose are quite simple. Am I thinking creatively as well as technically? And be honest. I've spoken to lots of people who say, yes, of course we are. And then you have a conversation with them and it becomes blindingly obvious they're not actually thinking that creatively at all. Secondly, are we, or am I, working as part of an ensemble? Am I working in an environment where status and hierarchy is important or is less important? Am I allowing my fellows to be able to step up and take the limelight to enable us to put on a better performance as a whole? And actually, I just quite give you one really interesting example, actually, because it's an MBA one, strangely enough. A few years ago, I was a partner at A.T. Kearney, one of the strat houses, and I was responsible for overseeing a case study competition which we ran for all the business schools globally. So there was a kind of an Asia region, there was an Americas region, there was an EMEA region. And I basically stood through hundreds of people, of MBA teams, and the prize was about 50,000 euros, so it was worth doing. And they all had the same case study, which is a pharmaceutical typical strategy case study. And the team that won did not have the best technical solution to the case study. But they came in and they put on a performance. They also worked as an ensemble. All of them had a role to play. They all went into the spotlight. They worked as a team. They had tried some different things, which were quite risky actually in the end, in terms of they didn't use PowerPoint slides. They used models and they used photos and all sorts of stuff. And they won hands down because, quite frankly, the bit that they understood is it's not usually the best solution that wins anything. It's the best performance that wins. And they put on the best performance and they worked as an ensemble. Are we telling compelling stories? Again, the number of times I've sat in pitches and people say, we're going to do this for you, we're going to do that for you, then we're going to do that for you. They don't tell me a story about connecting to me that says, you want us to do it for these reasons. We have to say, are we telling compelling stories, both as individuals in terms of my story, within my organization, within my looking for a job, within work I'm trying to get from clients or whatever, or stories we tell to customers, or even to our friends. What is our story? And could we tell a more compelling story that gets people more connected to us emotionally? Do we rehearse creatively? Most people don't, actually, not enough. And most people and organizations get very confused between the difference between rehearsing, which is trying new things, taking risks and being prepared to fail, and practicing, which is just making sure that my technical mastery is up to scratch. And finally, are we actually delighting our clients and stakeholders? I ask this question a lot to organizations, and interestingly, very few people can ever articulate an answer because they honestly do not know. And clearly you sit there and go, well, you're not making as much money as you were, so I would suggest you're probably not delighting your clients and stakeholders. And I think ultimately that's what this whole process comes back to. This is the starting question. And CEOs, when I sit and talk about performance thinking, this is the first question I'd say, do you know if you're delighting your clients and your stakeholders and your employees? And usually he doesn't understand the question. And then when you get into it, you see this kind of light bulb moment go on in his eyes, where he suddenly realizes that his biggest business issue is the fact he doesn't have an answer to the question. At that point, I get this. Well, it's all very well, all very nice and performing arts, but I'm mine all. So I'm a bit of a different business. We can't really change this. I've got budgets to hit and all the rest of it. But interestingly, you can. And there was a great example of an airline, which is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world. And they had a lot of problems in terms of employee and customer engagement. And they put a program that basically enabled their employees to actually put more of their own, personalities into just the flight experience process. And some of them started basically telling stories and jokes and singing, doing all sorts of things when they were working on the flights. And it had a huge improvement in terms of their reduction in staff turnover and their customer engagement. So whenever someone tells me, but we can't, I say, wrong answer. You always can. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that's roughly to time. It's been a bit of a quick canter through what is lots of stuff. Hopefully that sort of resonated with you and connected a few thoughts. And certainly at this point, we'd be more than happy to take whatever questions you might have. Over to you, Leah.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for that, Mark. I'm just going to open up our questions to see whether or not we have any in the... Bear with me. Well, I've had a few comments coming in saying great presentations, many thanks. So I'll just give people a couple of minutes just to make sure. If anyone has any questions, please do feel free to send them in the question section, and I will read them for the next 15 minutes or so to Mark and Jonathan. Right, so I've got some questions coming in. So Would you recommend a resource such as a book or a course to help us develop leadership skills?
Well, certainly, obviously, we'd recommend our books, which cover a lot of this stuff. And I think so. That's one way we'd start. We'd read the book. There's a lot in it, and there's lots of case studies which would help. I think the other thing I think you've got to do in terms of developing leadership skills in this space is actually it's not about reading books. There are actually courses available. We run them ourselves. But I would read around some of the performing arts thinking. There's a growing thing. And I wouldn't read a lot of the standard leadership books around leadership because I think a lot of them are quite frankly are out of date in terms of thinking. But that's kind of a starting point. To be honest, there aren't enough resources around. That's why one thing we're trying to do is to build much more resources for people who can actually engage around applying performance thinking to leadership. Jonathan, any thoughts?
Well, the other thing that we always sorry, Jonathan Gifford speaking. Nice to meet you all, as it were. One thing we both feel very strongly about it is that if you tell people things, it can have an impact, and it might be interesting, and that's great. But it's not really likely to change people's behaviours at a fundamental level. What will do that is some sort of engagement they have with something that hits them at a gut level and makes them think, oh wow, okay, I see what you mean. And that's why we like to work with actors and dancers and musicians and leaders, because when they see that very different way of performing, it has that kind of gut impact. They actually get what the dancer is doing or the jazz musician is doing. So read all the books. I mean, we write books. We're great believers in leadership books, but I would try and get yourself onto some kind of workshop where you engage with things that are very different and experience different things, because those probably are the things that will give you little light bulb moments.
Okay, perfect. We have another question. Does joining a performance art is joining performance art necessary to achieve this? Someone has asked.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not at all. I think everyone usually has some interest in a performance art. They like to watch films or listen to music, but you don't need to be a performance artist to actually do it. And I think that's what we've been trying to do, is to actually, as performance artists, we've been working with other performing artists to give a translation around how you can take the concepts that they apply so you can work with them. And the whole point of writing performance thinking was to give people effectively a structure to applying it. You don't need to be a performance artist to apply how performance artists work. So that's been the whole objective of what we're trying to do, is to give people effectively a structured way of approaching performing artists without being a performing artist. Jonathan, thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing we find is that actually nearly everybody has done a bit of performance in their life. It might have been, being the second shepherd in the nativity play, or singing in the choir, or playing in a band, or doing some AMBA dramatics. So most of us do have some small experience of performing, and the trick is to just think back to those days. Think about how you approached that and how different it felt. One of the blinding differences we find is when you do think back to that situation, you realize how much you were all working together to deliver a great performance than you were competing with each other, as you might find yourself doing in the workplace. So, no, absolutely, you don't have to be a performing artist to do this, but you probably have some little bits of experience tucked away in your youth that you can draw on quite usefully.
Okay, and then how can I learn to think creatively? Is it possible?
Everything is possible. I think, in a way, the Lego things, actually, I get a lot of people to do that, actually, because I think part of thinking creatively is also experiencing the creative process again for what it actually is. So somewhat, actually, I get people to actually do this, and I do it with people I coach, is actually we play with Lego, strangely enough. We actually go through a process of building some with instructions, and then building without instructions, and kind of make us feel, how did I think differently? How did I approach that now? Okay, so how would I approach that in this work situation they might be working with at the moment? So I think it's very easy to adopt creative thinking, but I think what you've got to do is adopt some of the principles we've been talking about. You've got to be prepared to fail. You've got to get comfortable with the idea that creativity often involves failure. You've got to get comfortable with the idea that actually being creative means doing things in a non-linear way, that actually, the path to success might be a bit of a twisty one. If you can get comfortable with those two or three things, actually, our experience is you can start to drive much more creative approaches and things. If you don't, a lot of this is around the assumptions we are driven on. Through education and training, development, all the rest of it, we are trained to be linear. We are trained to follow instructions and build the same things. Get comfortable with those things not applying, and then I think you'll find actually it's not as hard as people think.
I would add that, as Mark was saying, we spent a lot of time systematizing the 5 principles of performance thinking, and we did make tell a story, narrative, one of those core principles, because if you look at any successful performance, whether it's dance or music or a play, the story is at the heart of it. I don't know if you guys ever watched Strictly Come Dancing, but the winning performances are the ones where the judges could say, I love the story that you told in that dance. So we already get stories. We think of life as a series of stories. So I think any one of us can think about what's a good story, what is not a good story. And if we approach our businesses by thinking, well, what is the story of this business? That's a really interesting way to get creative, because the interesting thing about stories is, there are problems to be overcome. A good story has, a potential disaster. It has areas of danger. It has problems that are solved, things that you move through. I think if we could tell the story of our business in that engaging way, we would both understand our businesses better, and people would engage with us more because they would start to love our story. The greatest companies have a really good story to tell, and they keep telling it in everything they do. So thinking about the narrative, thinking about the story is a good way into thinking creatively.
Okay, so our next one is, how have you got businesses to work as an ensemble when hierarchies are the modus operandi of many organizations?
That's a good question. I like that one. The answer is not that easy. The answer is effectively we try to spend as much time as we can with top teams. So I mean, that photo I showed, for example, was with the part of the organization we work with. That was their board. So we try to actually say you've got to get people at the top to do it. And obviously a lot of what the work Jonathan and I do is working with the executive teams, because you're right, ultimately it's quite difficult with an organization as a whole if you don't get some of the drive for this from the very top. Having said that, we've also seen lots of examples where you can actually apply this just within parts of an organization. We work with lots of other project teams whereby they can apply these principles into the project they're working on together collectively as an ensemble, even though that's still operating within a broader kind of structured environment. So I think there are ways and means to do it. I think it's depending on the kind of organization you're in. I work in a lot of very structured organizations where we've had quite a lot of success building ensembles within certain parts of the organization, even though the overall organization is still fairly structured and fairly non-ensemble-like. I mean, for us, it's an ongoing mission. I think Jonathan and I have been on a 10-year mission to say we've got to change the way organizations think and work. It doesn't take a big shift in this space to actually make quite a big difference. And what we're seeing is more organizations are starting to actually come to us and say, actually, we need to make some changes. Even small changes here and there will make a big difference. It's not easy. Organizations, I think, are starting to get it, but it's very hard to let go of structures and hierarchies that you've had for ages. And I think as the next generation of CEOs come in, I think you'll see a big change over the next few years. Jonathan, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are. It is not easy. Hierarchy is insidious, and even if you create a non-hierarchical group, hierarchy will creep into it over time, and you have to keep on driving it out. What we tend to recommend to companies is that the non-hierarchical company is a very difficult thing to run, but it is perfectly possible, and many very large companies are now doing this, to create non-hierarchic areas. So more and more companies are looking for leaderless teams that are given a challenge and set about in a very creative way to solve that challenge, very much behaving as an ensemble. And it's quite possible to create within a larger organization a small team that really does function in a leaderless ensemble fashion. So a simple pragmatic solution might be create this little microcosm, realize that you will have to set these guys apart from the rest of the organization so they're not tainted by the hierarchy, but that can be done. On a more optimistic note, there are systems like holacracy. They're pretty complicated, but they are a kind of set of techniques and systems you can use in order to create a kind of level democratic organization. So it really is not easy, but there are some routes through.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. So my comment on the leadership would be like this is someone just giving me a comment. My comment on leadership would be like the upper leader who is trying to get the orchestra working at its best, links it to the performance artist concept. They just wanted to share that.
Yeah,
yes.
just
sorry, Mark,
so you'll take that, Jonathan?
Sorry, I was going to say that yes, one of the most fun things we do is to work with conductors, real conductors, and they, especially the technique we find most successful is they have a small chamber choir who have been trained to respond very literally, if you like, to the conductor's accent. And then we ask leaders to step in and conduct, and the choir will do literally whatever the conductor/leader does with their body, and that's it's a lot of fun, and it's very revealing, and it does show how absolutely your leadership is very much like the relationship between a conductor and an orchestra or a choir, in that we take the musicians take their direction, their tone, their emotions from the leader. You don't even have to have words to do that, and it is an interesting example of how leadership works in ways that we often don't think about because we're so literal. So sorry, Mark, what were you thinking?
No, the other point I'm saying, we've always recognised there's a slightly different connection point between, I mean, conductors obviously are usually slightly more directive. They're allowing people to do their best thing, but they are creating a slightly more directive approach than, say, you might find in a jazz group where there is actually no obvious leader in a jazz group. But they're all both doing the same, but what they are doing, though, is they are creating the environment within which the musicians can perform to their best to create the best overall result. So they're very much within our thinking around performing around great performances. There's a slightly different model. You know, say if you take the jazz group, it's a slightly more undirected route. If you take a dance couple, it's kind of two people doing it together. And so there are different kind of variations in terms of kind of the leadership model within performing arts, but they're all kind of linked to the same principles.
Okay, another question. Would you recommend having free time during working hours than working all the time? I mean free time as an investment for creative ideas or to arrive at new points of view. Because what I have seen in startups is they grow very fast, time is never enough to do things, and sometimes there's just a lot of thinking.
That's, again, interesting question. I mean, if you look at, the lack of time is an obvious one. What I would say is a couple of things. First of all, part of this is around mindset. A lot of it we find is not just about doing new stuff. It's getting yourself into a kind of mental place where you kind of are much more open to try to change and do different things. So for us, a lot of it, first of all, is changing the way you think about things. I mean, ultimately, to change any behavior, you've got to change people's mindsets. And I don't think that takes a lot of time. And one of the reasons we did write the book was to give people something they could easily digest and kind of use that as a way of triggering their own way of thinking about this. In terms of startups, there's a very interesting sort of paradox with startups, which is what makes them very creative when they start is the fact they don't need a lot of structure. They go very quickly, not worrying too much around the revenues and profits, and so they're much able to be much less structured. As they get more successful, and you could argue the same happened with Microsoft, the same is happening with Apple now, is as they get bigger and they get shareholders, it becomes much harder because more structure goes into it. Although interestingly, if you look at My Steam Engine is Broken, the first book we wrote, there's some interesting case studies in there. Some quite big businesses that enable quite a lot of creativity to be enabled in it. And we're talking businesses that like Mind stuff. So the issue with time is a hard one. A lot of it is around mindset. A lot of it is also, I mean, there are lots of examples of startups that, for example, allow a proportion of individuals' time to be used for creative thinking and approaches. Doesn't happen in all organizations. But ultimately, if enough people actually want to engage around being more creative, we find that actually organizations are quite open to it, whether it's startups or not. Jonathan, any thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking how we use startups as a perfect example. They start off in performance mode. They start off in a very creative way of thinking. You know, what's the best way to approach this market? What can we do that's radical, that's new, that's different? And then yes, when they hit that transition phase that Mark talked about, they switch into being steam engine operations, and they just think, how do we churn out the stuff as efficiently as possible? But the successful companies get through that, and I think Microsoft, Mark mentions Microsoft, I think they managed that. They were getting stuck into churning out Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 9, and they did realize that actually they were losing it. They were failing to give a good performance, and they have rather turned themselves around in recent years. So there is this terrible drag back to the the steam engine, let's just make stuff and chuck it out there model, and we have to keep on thinking, no, are we thinking clever? Are we delivering a great performance?
Okay, I've got a couple more questions if you both still have the time.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah. How would you suggest to introduce performance thinking in an organization that is traditionally not about performance? So thinking of a traditional, maybe political organization.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I suppose a couple of additional thoughts. One of the things we actually use, which is kind of a mechanism to try to open the conversation up, is we actually built a creativity diagnostic, which kind of measures creativity within an organization and how it's actually enabling creativity in its people. And when we actually run that for seniors in lots of different types of organization, they tend to have an aha moment when they realize just how far away they are and how big the gap is, and that kind of worries them. That's one thing. Secondly, we just run a number of workshops with different groups in an organization to get them to experience it, to go back to Johnson's point, to experience the arts. Sometimes we just get people to just run workshops and exercises. So there are lots of things we do in terms of what we're trying to do to enable that. Our experience is you can do it in any organization, whether it's I said we work with, oil and gas companies, mining companies, professional service companies, manufacturers, privately owned businesses, lots of quite traditional, quite kind of boring type of businesses that are nowhere near the creative world. And actually those are the organizations increasingly we find are adapting faster, because in some senses they've got a bigger need to try to change what they're doing. So often there's lots of things you can do, and we do lots of different types of interventions. And sometimes it's just been about, there was one organization I think of where quite a relatively junior manager came to me and said, I really would like to try and help us become more creative. And he internally just drove a process with us to get the senior people to actually just experiment with a few things to make them think differently, and it worked really well. So I think any individual, if they really think it's important, which we think it is obviously, can try to actually do stuff even within their teams. So we've worked with just within teams and organizations, we work with boards, and sometimes we just send people a book and say, here, read this, have a think about it. So I think there are things you can do. For us, this is the start of a journey. I think we are at the beginning of kind of the world of performance thinking. But what we have been generally pleasantly happy about is a lot of embracing around these ideas by a lot of quite interesting organisations, of which we can't talk to you about.
I think we're finding that the basic technique for this is always the same. It has to start from the top, so you do need leadership. But that leader needs to think of themselves as what we call being in charge, but not in control. So the leadership is not telling everybody what to do. It's simply trying to find the best direction. And then to talk to everybody, but literally everybody, to give everybody a voice. And the theatre model is a good one. Just imagine that you are the director, this is the cast, get the cast together and ask them to have ideas. Most organizations are very top down. A small group of people decide that they have all the answers and they issue the orders. When you open it up to the whole group and say, okay, here's our challenge, here's where we want to get to, what do you think is the best way to do that? It's surprising how many good ideas come out from surprising sources. So the basic technique is, give up some control. Think of yourself as a conductor of an orchestra and not as the foreman of a work gang, and then tap into the organization, see what ideas the organization has, because it's normally surprising. The organization normally has some surprising good ideas.
Okay, I have a couple of more if that's okay. So someone said, what you've told us is probably difficult to implement in government organizations in Asia, because if you try to show your creativity, you might find yourself. Have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's one thought, and also accepting that there are certain sort of contexts with regards to cultures. But I think one of the things we encourage people to do in those contexts is at least focus on the things you can do in terms of things like telling your stories better. We know that most actually Asian cultures are very responsive to storytelling, but we actually find in organisations they're very bad at it. So I think just picking up some things at an individual level is very good. You're right, they're not hierarchically driven. But yet, strangely enough, Asian cultures are actually quite open to creativity and the arts, more so than many Western ones are. So I think it is a bit of a paradox in that sense. But I think, again, there are things you can do as an individual to be more creative in terms of how you approach things without trying to sort of put yourself in conflict with the organisation around you. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yes, I'm not sure if I understood the question fully. I've been talking about being friendless, so I may be on the wrong, taking this at the wrong angle, but the other thing that is very true of performance is that you do have to open yourself up to the rest of the ensemble and make yourself quite vulnerable. The point about successful ensembles is that they are trusting places, they are psychologically safe places where you can make yourself slightly vulnerable in the certain knowledge that you will not actually be damaged, that people will not take advantage of that. So I think the answer might be to be brave and put yourself out there and look for support. But to do that, you will need to have created a genuine ensemble, not a kind of hostile environment. I don't know if that's to the point.
Okay, so I have, when defining why at the organization level, why have we chose to do what we do, we should imply all the employees. This why is different from the vision and the mission of the organization.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that goes back to Jonathan's point around kind of what our personal mission is trying to get organisations to open up their cultures and work in slightly different ways. I mean, I think we've made a lot of grounds around the whole diversity inclusion agenda. This is a different agenda, I think, around opening up organisations to changing some of the approach. And I'll give you one example, which is a big one, and that's KPIs, key performance indicators, my personal bugbear. Organisations kill it, a lot of it, because of how they approach performance indicators, which are largely driven by rewarding tasks and the outputs of activity. They don't have a lot of KPIs that reward behaviours and approaches and attitudes, which actually we know historically, and we know increasingly from research, drives a lot of the success in terms of hard numbers. So one of the things we kind of particularly work with organisations on is around getting them to at least change a few of the KPIs to create a slightly broader environment where people feel able to take a couple of risks, to spend a bit of time on creative thinking and working on ensemble building without it actually affecting their personal success. So I think there's a lot of things you can do quite simply in organisations around just adapting a few KPIs that can make a big difference. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yes, I mean it's a huge question, but we've been working recently with a private equity company, and so these are hard-nosed business people. They buy companies, but they've been through their own little epiphany after 4 or 5 years of business, and they realized that the successes they had came when they had people involved in the businesses who were passionate about what they did. So they had the expertise. This comes up to our notion of practice, but more importantly, they were actually set on fire by what they did. And if they focused on the people more than on the business model, if you like, more than on the classic management stuff, that was where they saw financial success. So it does take a complete change of mindset. But actually, if you think about people and passion and great stories, it doesn't come naturally to business people, but actually it works.
Okay, perfect. Do you see any conflict within companies between the individual's career development plans and ensemble work, and how do you overcome this?
Well, I suppose it's kind of part of the same. What I would say is increasingly very few people are successful if they actually don't work well with people, and I think that's become an increasing trend. So I think I'm not sure the two things are disconnected. I think the ability to be able to work in an ensemble way is going to become increasingly important to success in careers. So I think actually one of the things I would argue, and I see a lot of MBAs that I hire, is actually the ones that seem to be going further are adapting their way of approaching, and they're becoming a lot slightly less task-driven, slightly less focused on what they're doing, and slightly more focused on teams and ensemble work. So I think ultimately it has to be part of your career structure. I think you have to adapt, and you still have to be aware of the organisation, whichever it is that you're in, and how much you can actually do that. But my personal view is individuals who don't build ensemble capability and don't think more in an ensemble way are less likely to be successful going forward in most organisations that I work with. Jonathan, your thoughts?
Yes, well, I think this goes to the heart of ensemble work and of our traditional mindsets, in that we tend to be, there are good psychological reasons for this, but we tend to be very, we feel a great sense of ownership of our ideas. It's my idea, and I'm going to use it, and I'm going to benefit from it. If we're going to work as ensembles, we have to put our ideas out there and not be precious about them, and let other people work with them and change them and play with them. That's absolutely at the heart of ensemble work. So people need to be individually creative, but they need to stop thinking, no, that's, my idea is the only one that can work. I have to see that one through, because they have to be prepared to let that go and say, let me put that out there to the group, and then the group can take it where it wants. Otherwise, you don't have ensemble work. You just have a bunch of, possibly brilliant people, but they're just working alongside each other. They're not working as an ensemble.
Okay, and then last question, delighting the clients and stakeholders, could you please give a bit more detail? What does it mean from your perspective?
I suppose a couple of things really. I mean, to one extent, I suppose I use the example that I mentioned around the case study team. They delighted the audience because they engaged us, they had humour, they spoke to why a lot, and not just what they're going to do, but why they thought their solution was the way to do it. So I think there's a whole thing around the connectivity and around the why. I think the other thing around delighting the audience is it's an ongoing process of what else can we do that will make us stand out. And I think it's constantly asking that question. And again, if you take the example of, I was involved in coaching a project team recently, we spent a whole day saying, what else can we do? How can we make ourselves stand out? How do we make their experience different to what they're going to get from 14 other competitors who are going to pitch them? So for me, a lot of it is about saying, let's ask the question and explore things and try different stuff. And sometimes you take risks and it fails. What I will say, though, is if you don't try different things that run the risk, so take the theatre, they try different ways of staging, different ways of costuming, they try things. It doesn't always work. But what happens is often you increasingly get a magic where you delight something because you give the audience something they didn't expect. And that's what dancers do, it's what musicians do, it's what great actors do. So what is it we can do that they're not expecting us to do? So for example, it's a simple one, but I turned up to a pitch a while ago, and we turned up and just basically told stories. We did the whole pitch by telling narrative stories around the different things they wanted to know. And it did delight the audience because they were so bored being PowerPointed to death that they came out, and one guy said, that's the best presentation I've ever had. I'd be amazed if you didn't get the deal. And they got the deal. Jonathan, any further thoughts?
Well, I think some very mundane examples are quite useful. I mean, I haven't actually been in a pret-a-manger lately, but the last time I did, I was really impressed. So I just bought a sandwich and a coffee, but when I walked in there, the people at the tills, there's chains of people queuing up to get to the till, and whoever is free is shouting up, saying, over here, I'm free, come on, how can I help you? And they've just managed to instill in their staff, a level of energy and a sense that they're actually enjoying serving you. So that was a great performance. I came out with my sandwich and my coffee, and I was delighted. I was happy. So I think a lot of companies lose sight of that interface between the front line and the audience, and that needs to be a delightful performance. And very often isn't. Very often we're fobbed off with robots or very unpleasant customer interactions. And that's a basic performance failure, because that's where it matters. That's where the actors meet the audience.
And I think there was just one person who said, as a follow-up question, will ensemble work present a challenge for individual performance management?
Actually, personally, I don't personally think so. It goes back to the KPI question. I think as long as organizations, and I think they will be prepared to adopt more KPIs that are more team-based, and they often do, I don't think that will be a problem. I mean, an example of an organization I work with at the moment has done exactly that. They've basically made team goals primary. So effectively, if the team wins, they will get the best evaluation. Even if individuals, standard KPIs within sales are down, they are not going to be taken into account. And that is encouraging the team to say, well, what do we need to do collectively? How do we leverage our individual skills? What else can we do to get the team results? And so individual performance management has been taken out in terms of the age-old thing, which I fit a lot in my career in consulting, which is for one person to be successful, I need somebody else to fail. I don't think it's that difficult. And it's not that the organization has abandoned sales and margin targets. Of course it hasn't. What it's done is it's enabled those to be done at team levels in a number of places in the organization. So individual performance management is just based on the team. And then what's happening is they're then looking at contribution. So you say, there's the team targets, they will hit it, they will get great results. And then we just look at how people behaved, and we actually look more and more at peer review, where people say, actually, Bob did, it was his idea that cracked that thing. He's a great guy, works really well. And that's being taken into account. So actually, I don't think it's that difficult. I think HR departments themselves are part of the problem because they don't like that. But business leaders increasingly are recognizing that's the reality of what they need to do. They need people to work together in an ensemble way if they're going to be really successful and meet their competitors. Jonathan?
Yes, well, the HR thing is a bit of a, HR is a bit of a steam engine department, or it can be. It can be a great department, but it can sort of exist in order to pigeonhole people into little slots and say, this is what you must do, and you mustn't do anything else, and you mustn't think differently about it. And we've got a reward structure that rewards that. And unless, yes, we can't build, I think Mark is absolutely right. It is perfectly possible to do this, but we won't do it if we keep the same old reward structures. If we reward people for basically beating their colleagues, then we're not going to build ensemble. So we do have to change all of our structures to focus on teamwork, not individual work, which is not easy, but it's not impossible. It really is not.
All right, well, that's the end of our questions. Thank you very much for taking some extra time to answer all the questions from the audience. I just want to thank you very much, Mark and Jonathan. That was excellent. I believe this is one of the biggest webinars we've ever had. We had a number of people who were trying to actually queue to listen to the webinar because we were at capacity. So everyone that got to tune in was very lucky. So thank you very much for delivering a very interesting topic. I'm sure the rest of the audience would agree. I've had a lot of people emailing me saying how good that was and how useful they found the presentation, and a lot of requests for the video of the webinar, which will be shared in about a week or so post-event. So thank you very much, Mark and Jonathan. Thank you all for listening. Just to let you know, our next webinar will be on the 13th of February at the same time of 12 to 1, and that will be with John Lees, and it will be Get Ahead in Your New Job. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to everyone who listened, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Bye all.